Hello everybody. Let's talk about the recommended conditional access policies. Conditional access policies in general are the way how you secure your cloud identities in Microsoft Entra ID. That should be the baseline that you define for your organization that sets the requirements when authenticating, such as MFA needs to be used, or compliant devices need to be used, and similar. So it's very important to have a solid background of conditional access policies. The problem that I very often see is that customers usually have quite a lot of conditional access policies, but the conditional access policies actually doesn't cover the baseline. And by the baseline, I mean the scenarios that should always apply, or the requirements that should be always in place. What I mean is that very often I see conditional access policies focused on some specific scenarios, such as we require multi-factor authentication for Office 365 services, or we require compliant devices for this custom application that we have integrated with Microsoft Entra ID. But they are completely missing the baseline. What happens when someone authenticates to some other application? Because there are many other applications that are integrated potentially with Microsoft Entra ID. Even the built-in applications that are part of every tenant, of every Microsoft Entra ID. All the conditional access policies are focused only on a specific group of users. And they don't have any baseline that says, okay, this would be required for all users no matter what. So the policies are usually focused on specific scenarios only, and the customers are usually missing really some baseline. The other problem I see is that administrators very often don't understand how conditional access policies are evaluated. I'm not going to go into much details here because it's very well documented in the Microsoft documentation. But there are two things that are very important. The first is that all conditional access policies are always evaluated. So even if you have like 50 conditional access policies, all of them will be evaluated, always. The second thing is that all of the conditional access policy requirements needs to be satisfied. Even if you say that, for instance, MFA is not required for a specific scenario, if there is some other policy that says MFA is required, then MFA is required. What I mean is that all conditional access policies are evaluated and all requirements configured in the conditional access policies always must be satisfied. Even if some policy says you can do this, if there is another policy that says you cannot do this, or you can do that under some conditions, then you must meet all of the requirements. And that's another misunderstanding. Because administrators are used to, for example, firewall rules that are usually evaluated from the top to the bottom. And when the first rule meets the requirements, then you are good to go. It's not the case for conditional access policies, where conditional access policies are all evaluated and all need to be satisfied. There are some advantages and disadvantages of this approach, but it is what it is. So all conditional access policies must be always satisfied, and all conditional access policies are always evaluated. That's the baseline. Let's get to the recommended conditional access policies. I always start with the templates that are available in all tenants. So if you go to the new policy from template, all templates, here are all the templates that Microsoft recommends. That should be also for you the starting point. So go through the templates and implement as many of them as possible. Some of the templates are duplicate, or there could be multiple templates that do the same or very similar, but go through the list and apply or create as many of them as possible. All right, let's go back to the actual recommended conditional access policies. I have a list of 28 conditional access policies that I in general recommend creating in all tenants. Here also I have some conditional access policies that are potentially duplicates of some conditional access policies are redundant. The reason why I have this full list here is to give you some guidance, give you some ideas of what you should create. Conditional access policies are not one size fits all. It's always about the requirements of each specific organization. But I want to show you what you can do and what you should do with conditional access policies. But then at the end of the day, it's your decision, it's your environment, so it's your responsibility. All right, let's get to it. First conditional access policy is targeted on break glass accounts. Break glass accounts are emergency access accounts. You should always have at least one emergency account created in your environment. Again, I'm not going to go into much details about emergency access accounts because you can find a blog article on my blog that specifically talks about emergency access accounts, how you should create those accounts, how you should protect those accounts, how you should use those accounts, monitor those accounts, and so on. So if you are interested, and you should be actually interested, go to my blog, Cybersecurity World, and read the article there. But I have one conditional access policy focused specifically on my break glass accounts. And this one policy is the only policy that's actually applied to break glass accounts, because all other policies have break glass accounts in exclusions. And that's the very important part of it. So break glass accounts should be excluded from all conditional access policies. Always. Then it's up to you, whether or not you would have one conditional access policy focused on break glass accounts. Because there are some people that recommend that there should be no policy at all applied to break glass accounts. On the other hand, there are people saying that it's fine if you require FIDO2 or phishing-resistant authentication. I'm one of those guys that say it's okay to require FIDO2 authentication for break glass accounts. But on the other hand, I also understand the people that are saying that there should be no conditional access policy at all. Because before there were the phishing-resistant authentication methods available, the reason for excluding break glass accounts from all conditional access policies was related to the fact that there could be some dependencies. Break glass accounts should always work. That's the primary reason of having break glass accounts. So you know that those accounts will always work, no matter what. So it's very important that those accounts don't have any restrictions such as compliant devices or the standard multi-factor authentication methods, because there are some dependencies, service dependencies on the background, or dependencies in terms of, like, for instance, the compliant devices. Maybe you don't have any compliant devices handy. But it's different with phishing-resistant authentication. Because technically, phishing-resistant authentication doesn't have any service dependencies. So in my opinion, it's safe to require phishing-resistant authentication for break glass accounts because there are no dependencies. So there is nothing that would fail on Microsoft side, and so that you wouldn't be able to sign in to your break glass accounts. But on the other hand, there are still people saying that what if the evaluation of conditional access policies in general is failing? Okay, yeah, that's probably valid. But anyway, what I meant to say is that I have this one policy that's focused on break glass accounts specifically, and the only thing it does is that it's applied to only my break glass account. I have one break glass account in this lab environment. It's this one. You will see that this account will be excluded from all other policies. Each and every policy has this account in exclusions. But I have this one policy. Let's apply it to this break glass account. It targets all resources, all cloud applications, and the only thing it does is that it requires phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. The reason for that is that, like I said, there are no dependencies, service dependencies for phishing-resistant authentication. It will work even if the MFA service is failing. Phishing-resistant authentication always works. But on the other hand, if you have phishing-resistant authentication configured for the account, you will be able to use the authentication even without this policy. So the reason why I have this policy configured is purely that I want to actually enforce it. Because technically, Microsoft Entra ID accounts always have a password, and the password in general will always work. So there is nothing like in on-prem ID that you could disable password authentication because you can check the checkbox that smart card logon is required for interactive login. There is nothing like that in Microsoft Entra ID. So technically the password would work. And that's the reason why I have this conditional access policy here, because this conditional access policy technically enforces phishing-resistant authentication, which technically blocks usage of passwords. All right, so that's the first policy. Next policy is focused on admin accounts. So I have 14 roles defined here. This policy is based on one of the templates that I showed you before. So these are the most privileged roles in Microsoft Entra ID. And this policy is focused on the role. Break glass account is excluded. Like I said, it will be excluded from all conditional access policies. I target all resources, no exclusions here, and I require authentication strength. There is one important thing that I would like to mention. Don't use require multi-factor authentication, this first option here. Don't use it for anything. Even Microsoft says that you should use authentication strength instead of require multi-factor authentication. So even if I change it to this, you will see that Microsoft recommends using authentication strength. I've created one custom authentication strength, which is the standard MFA. The standard MFA authentication strength defines the authentication methods that I want to allow in general. I definitely recommend you doing the same. So configure your own custom authentication strength and define the authentication methods that you want to allow or you want to actually enforce. So this is the only thing we do here. So applying this policy to all highly privileged roles and requiring multi-factor authentication for all applications. Next policy is require multi-factor authentication for internal users. And this is actually the baseline that I was talking about at the beginning of this session. And that's what I very often am missing when talking to customers, because they have these policies focused on specific user groups, usually. But what about the other users that are in your environment? What about the rest of the population that you have there? How are those users protected? You should always have some baseline defined in your environment, such as this one. So all users MFA for all cloud applications. This is the baseline that defines the basic requirements in my environment. So I'm sure that there are no gaps in coverage. So no users are excluded or no applications are excluded, because I define all users, I exclude guests and external users, and of course the break glass account, but I will get back to guests and external users later, because I have another policy specifically for guests and external users. But as you can see, there are no other exclusions, no excluded users or groups other than the break glass account. I target all cloud applications, no exclusions here, and I again require authentication strength, standard MFA. That defines the baseline. So pretty much these first two policies define the baseline for me. So I have a policy for privileged users and I have a policy for all other users. That is basically the baseline for me. Let me get back to the first policy that's targeting privileged users. What I very often see here is that it's not targeting roles, but it's targeting groups instead. And the customers tend to say something like, all administrators are members of this group. Okay, but I see two problems with that. First problem is that if it's a regular security group in Microsoft Entra ID, even less privileged administrators can manipulate with group membership, which means that not only global administrators, for instance, but also other less privileged administrators can add or remove users from the group. And that potentially creates weaknesses in coverage of your conditional access policies. So if you target groups, it needs to be role-enabled groups, because role-enabled groups can be managed only by global administrators or privileged authentication administrators. No other roles can manage role-enabled groups. So at least make it a role-enabled group. Don't create standard security group for your privileged roles, because that can potentially be misused. The other problem I see here is, how do you manage membership of the group? Are you sure that there is always 100% coverage? Because I wouldn't be so sure about that. Usually it's manually managed. So there is a new administrator, so they put the administrator to the group. But what if you forget? What if someone forgets to put the newly created administrator to the group? Or on the other hand, what if the administrator is not an administrator any longer? It's a regular user, and you forget to remove the user from the group. Then there will be applied restrictions that don't need to be applied there. That's the reason why I always recommend target roles, don't target groups. Because again, this is the safe way how to configure it. You can be always sure that whenever is someone added or on the other hand removed from a privileged role, this always will be reflected here. All right. Policy number 3, block legacy authentication. This is again based on the templates. I target all users, again with the only exclusion of the break glass account. I target all cloud apps. And what I define in conditions is that I target one specific client app, which is this other clients. Other clients is a bucket that consists of IMAP4, POP, and SMTP protocols. These protocols are called legacy authentication protocols, and it's called legacy because it doesn't support the modern authentication way. What I mean by that is that it doesn't support multi-factor authentication. That's the biggest problem of that. According to Microsoft statistics, 99.9% of attacks target legacy authentication protocols simply because there is no MFA. There is technically no way how you can enforce MFA on legacy authentication protocols, because that's just the application window that asks for username and password, and there is technically no way how you can do MFA. Attackers know that, and that's the reason why they target it. So it's very, very important to disable it. If you open the template that's available there, you would see that also Exchange Active Sync clients is included in the block legacy authentication template. The reason why I have it excluded from this policy is that I have another policy that targets specifically Exchange Active Sync clients. The reason for that, there are two reasons. One is easier reporting and troubleshooting. And that's in general my recommendation. Try to make your conditional access policies as much focused on one specific thing as possible. Rather have more conditional access policies doing one specific thing than having one conditional access policy that aims to cover everything. Because it will be then easy for you to do mistakes and it will be pretty hard to troubleshoot that then. So I have excluded Exchange Active Sync from here. I have only other clients included because I have another policy for Exchange Active Sync clients. So one reason was the troubleshooting and easy management. The other reason is that very often there are organizations that need to exclude Exchange Active Sync at least for specific users. Because other clients, like I said, it's IMAP, it's POP, it's SMTP, those protocols are usually not needed. No one usually uses it. So we can just go ahead and disable it. For Exchange Active Sync, it's a different story. Because Exchange Active Sync protocol is used by, for instance, the native mail applications on some mobile platforms, such as the built-in Apple Mail client uses Exchange Active Sync, or the Samsung Mail client also uses Exchange Active Sync. Microsoft's official applications don't need it. So if you have, or if you want to enforce Microsoft official applications only in your environment, you can disable Exchange Active Sync completely. But there are organizations, or let me put it this way, there are people, usually the C-level people in organizations that tend to say, I want to use my Apple Mail email client on my iPhone or on my Mac or iPad. I don't want to use Outlook. And there is usually not much that the IT can do about it. So that's another reason why I have a separate policy for that, because we would block legacy authentication, these other clients, for everyone, and we would just do some exclusions for the Exchange Active Sync clients in the other policy. So it gives you more granularity. And the access control here is block. So I block other clients, which is the IMAP, POP, SMTP protocols for all users for all cloud applications. Policy number 4, like I've already mentioned, targets block Exchange Active Sync. The policy configuration is almost the same. So all users, break glass account excluded, all cloud apps. Here, technically, it would be enough if you select Office 365. Because Exchange Active Sync, there is probably no other application that would use Exchange Active Sync other than Exchange Online. So you can just target Office 365 and the result would be the same. On the other hand, if you target all cloud apps, it doesn't hurt and it gives you full coverage no matter what. Under the conditions part, there is the only change here, which is we are targeting Exchange Active Sync client. And we again block it. Policy number 5, block access for unknown or unsupported device platform. This is very important policy because you as an organization should define what platforms are supported. Those platforms should be managed via Intune, for example, and all other platforms should be completely blocked. So I target all users, again here, break glass account excluded, all cloud applications, and under conditions, I have something configured in device platforms. And the way I have it configured here is the secure way of having it configured. Because here what I usually see also, or quite often see here, is organizations target only selected platforms. So for instance, they would configure it like this. So they say, okay, we don't support Windows 4 and Linux. So they would just select these two platforms and do block. But then I say, okay, what about all other platforms? Because the platform detection is very often, or in most cases, based on the user agent string. And you can fake it. So my user agent string could look like Cybersecurity World. That could be my user agent string for the operating system, pretty easily. That would super simply bypass this restriction, because they block specifically Windows Phone and Linux only. Everything else is enabled, is allowed. So if I change my user agent string to be Cybersecurity World as the operating system, then I will be allowed to access the cloud environment. So that's the reason why I say it's very important to do it the other way around and choose I block everything that is not specifically excluded. And this is the safe way how to configure it. So if I want to allow in my environment Android, iOS, Windows and macOS, which is the typical configuration, I would configure it this way. So I block any device platform excluding these 4 selected platforms. Everything else will be blocked. So if it's Windows Phone, it will be blocked. If it's Linux, it will be blocked. If it's a device platform of Cybersecurity World, it will be blocked as well. So this is the safe way how to configure it. And the grant access is obviously block. Policy number 6. Securing security info registration. I target all users. I have some exclusions here. This policy protects the security info registration process. What it means is the security info registration process is the process when you register or change your authentication methods. And it should be secure because when we do incident response, which I unfortunately do quite often, we see threat actors registering their own MFA. Because then when a threat actor is able to register their own MFA, it means that the threat actor is pretty much able to bypass or satisfy most of the conditional access policy requirements. Because the requirements are usually based, you need to do MFA here and there, in this situation and that situation. If they are able to register their own MFA, it means they are able to satisfy that. So it needs to be secured so that we know that only our users are able to actually register or change MFA or the authentication methods in general. There is one important thing, because the restrictions are typically based on my users, my devices, my corporate environment, we need to exclude external users, because otherwise they wouldn't be probably able to satisfy the requirements. So we exclude all external users and guests. What I also exclude is global administrator role. It's just some kind of a sanity check. It's not necessary, but global administrator roles are the most privileged roles. We probably don't need to or should apply these restrictions to those roles. But because we have the break glass account also excluded, it wouldn't probably hurt if we enforced also for global administrators. But again, this is also defined in the template. So I simply left it here, but in real situations, I very often configure it like this. So it's required for everyone. It's just super important to put the break glass account here, so you don't lock yourself out. In the target resources, here is a change. We don't target cloud applications, we target actually user actions. So you need to change it in this drop-down menu to user actions and check this register security information option here. That's the process of registering or changing the authentication methods. And here are the exclusions. So I exclude trusted locations. See, all trusted networks and locations are excluded. And I also exclude compliant devices. And here is another interesting thing. I have it configured this way because, again, this is the safe way how to configure it. So I exclude only devices that has specifically this is compliant attribute set to true. In other words, this configuration says that I include all devices that doesn't have the is compliant property set to true. You see, is compliant not equals true, then it is included in this policy. So unless your device is compliant, you will be targeted by this policy. The reason why it's configured like this and not like this, because this is also the configuration I sometimes see. This is not the bulletproof configuration, because it specifically says that the is compliant attribute needs to be false. But what if the is compliant attribute is not configured or is not populated for whatever reason? Maybe because just the evaluation is failing or whatever. Then this device wouldn't be included in the policy. So the safe way is to configure it like this. So unless it is specifically true, then the device will be restricted. All right. And the restriction I have configured here is require multi-factor authentication. So to summarize it, because this is a little more complicated than the previous conditional access policies. So I target all users except for global administrators, the break glass account, and external users. And I require multi-factor authentication for the process of security info registration unless you are coming from a compliant device or you are coming from a trusted network or location. Maybe you are wondering now, okay, this is the process of registering security information, how you can enforce actually multi-factor authentication, because I'm just registering it. That's a good question. But don't forget about the two exclusions. So it will not apply to you if you are coming from a compliant device, which should be true for hopefully all cases. You will be doing this from your corporate device and the corporate device will be actually compliant. Or you at least will be doing it from your corporate network that's trusted. So then this will not apply. You will be excluded from the policy. Even if you are doing it from a non-compliant device and non-trusted location, you still have the option to do MFA. Maybe you already have some other methods registered. Let's say you already have phone authentication or the push notification registered, and you are just adding, for instance, FIDO2 authentication to your account. Because adding or changing the authentication methods also falls into this bucket of security info registration process. So maybe you already have something registered and you are just changing in or adding some other options. I would be just careful with the exclusions here because the trusted networks is not as secure as, for instance, requiring compliant devices. This will change with the Entra ID private access that's still in preview, because at the moment you just define it via named locations, which just sets some public IP addresses, and that's usually not recommended to put exclusions on public IP addresses because it could be faked, or you can have a threat actor already in your environment and the threat actor would be able to satisfy this requirement. So I would probably try to exclude only compliant devices, not trusted locations. But this is just to give you the idea and the options that are available. All right, policy 6. Policy 7. Require multi-factor authentication for management portals. I have all users included here. Only Break-Glass account again is excluded. I target one specific app, and that's the Microsoft Admin Portals app. It's not actually an app, it's a group of applications. If I hover this information, it says that the admin portals include Microsoft 365 Admin Center, Exchange Admin Center, Azure Portal, Entra Admin Center, and so on. So this app group consists of all admin portals that Microsoft has in the cloud. And what I do here, I require MFA again. What this policy does is that it requires multi-factor authentication when you are accessing any of the admin portals. No matter if it's Azure Portal or Security Center or Intune Admin Center or the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you always will have to do MFA. The reason for this policy here is, or the difference between the policy that targeted admin roles is that for the admin roles, we specifically targeted admin roles. Here we target the applications and all users. So it's some kind of an extension of the policy number 1. The reason for having this policy here is that there might be users that are actually not members of the 14 most privileged roles because they have, for instance, one of the less privileged roles. Or maybe they don't have any Microsoft Entra ID role because they just are accessing some Azure resources. Maybe they have privileges over Azure virtual machines or some resource group in Azure or subscriptions or management groups, whatever. But we always want to enforce MFA whenever someone is accessing the privileged portals, let's say. So this is what this conditional access does. So it's not redundant. Then we have policy number 8 that requires multi-factor authentication for guest access. And I've mentioned it already previously. Because if you remember, guests were excluded from the standard MFA requirement that required MFA for regular users. Now we have this policy that requires MFA specifically for external users only. That's the reason why there is no exclusion, because there is no need to exclude the Break-Glass account from this policy, because Break-Glass account is internal user, so it doesn't apply at all to the Break-Glass account. Of course, you can put the Break-Glass account here to exclusions as well for, if you want to have it like configured the same way, but it's not necessary at all here. We target all cloud applications and we define the requirements, which is MFA. The reason for having a separate policy is, again, reporting, potentially troubleshooting, and also the granularity, because maybe you require stronger MFA for your internal users, but you cannot afford to require such strong MFA for external users, for instance. Because here I have the multi-factor authentication strength required, which means that it's potentially any authentication method, including the SMS or phone call authentication, which, by the way, I don't allow in this standard MFA that I require from my internal users. So it just gives you more control and better reporting. Next one is require compliant device for administrators. Here we have again the 14 roles selected, Break-Glass account excluded. We target all cloud applications and we require device to be marked as compliant. This is also very important. Administrators should always use compliant devices. Administrators should never use non-compliant devices. They should never be able to access their highly privileged accounts from a personal computer or potentially any computer. They should always use only compliant devices. Require multi-factor authentication for risky sign-ins. This policy requires Microsoft Entra ID Premium P2 licenses All of the previous policies were available also with P1 licenses. This one requires P2. We target all users, again excluding break glass account, all cloud applications, and there is one condition configured. By the way, these first three options will not be available in your tenant unless you have at least one P2 license in your tenant. So if you don't have a P2 license, you will not see these first three options at all in your environment. But I have P2 licenses available here. What I configure here is that if there is any risk detected during the authentication, MFA will be always enforced. And that's what I configure here. MFA is enforced. And what I also configure here is that you will have to re-authenticate. Because normally your existing you may already have your access token and refresh token. The tokens may already contain the claim about MFA that's been done in the past. Then you will not be asked for MFA again. But when there is a detected risk for the authentication, the token will be invalidated and you will be asked to authenticate again. So this is what this policy does. The session sign-in frequency is every time. So it will ask you, hey, you need to sign in again. Very important. Block high-risky sign-ins. I target all users, break glass account excluded. I target all applications. And here the condition again has a risk configured, which in this case is a high risk. And we say block access. So whenever there is a high risk detected, then the access is blocked completely. High risk usually means that it's an anonymous proxy or anonymous VPN that's used for the access. That triggers a high risk sign-in attempt, and such attempt will be blocked completely. Next policy is require password change for high-risk users. So whenever a user account is marked as high-risk user, password change will be required. The risk level on user accounts is based on past activities. So if there were high-risk sign-ins, the account will be also marked with high risk. Or if Microsoft Entra ID identity protection detects credential leak for the user will be marked as high-risk user. What's configured here is we target all users, break glass account excluded. We target all applications. And the condition is user risk is high. Then we require password change and invalidate the tokens. So this effectively blocks user access until password is changed for the account. Policy number 13 is no persistent browser session from unmanaged devices. We target all users, excluding again break glass account, all cloud applications, and the conditions are web browser. This is very important because session control doesn't technically work anywhere else. So we are targeting only the web browser. And again, we target non-compliant devices. So this is the same configuration that we have already seen on one of the previous policies. So unless is compliant property is true, this policy will be applied. And what we do here, we define sign-in frequency to be 1 hour, and we define that persistent browser sessions will not be allowed. It will never be a persistent browser session. The reason for this policy is that whenever user authenticates is using a non-compliant computer, it could be their personal computer or some other computer in general, they will be allowed to use web browser for accessing cloud resources, but they will be forced to re-authenticate every hour thanks to this configuration, and persistent cookie will not be set. It means that when the browser is closed, the cookie is invalidated, and then the user, if the user opens the browser again, the user needs to sign in again. This is very important because we don't want to allow persistent or long time living sessions on unmanaged devices or non-compliant devices. Because imagine if it's a personal computer of the employee, it may sound, let's say, okay, but you never know what computer it is, because it may be a friend's computer, or it may be a computer in a hotel lobby or airport lounge. And you definitely want to keep persistent sessions on hotel lobby computers. And that's the reason why this policy is very important. But like I said, it's not a one size fits all. Maybe you allow using personal computers, and then 1 hour re-authentication will be very annoying for users. So you would, for instance, configure it like 8 hours, 10, 12 hours, something like that. Or on the other hand, ideally, you don't allow using unmanaged devices at all, then this policy is not required at all, because simply everything that's non-compliant will be blocked completely. But this policy is when you allow unmanaged devices, you at least should limit the session lifetime on those unmanaged devices. Policy number 14. We target all users, excluded is the break glass account, all cloud applications. We target only 2 platforms here, hence the Android and iOS. The reason for that this policy or this configuration that we configure here, which is the require approved client app or require app protection policy, technically works only on Android and iOS. That's the reason why we include only Android and iOS platforms. And what this policy says is that it requires that the client application is either one of the approved client apps, which if you click this link, it opens a new page that says what is actually approved client app, which is pretty much the official client applications. And if the user is not using one of the official client applications, it will require app protection policy. App protection policies are configured by Microsoft Intune. So if the user is using like the Apple Mail client, Samsung Mail client, and so on, app protection policies will be required. Policy number 15. We target all users, break glass account is excluded. We target Office 365 app here only, because this application targets, or this policy targets Office 365 only. And what we do is that we enforce use app enforced restrictions. So these are the restrictions that are configured on the Office 365 side, and you want to enforce it on all devices, all applications of all users. Policy number 16. This policy is potentially redundant. We target 14 highly privileged roles, excluding the break glass account. We target all cloud applications, and we require phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. Here it depends if you are able to enforce phishing-resistant authentication for your administrators. Because if you are able to enforce phishing-resistant authentication for your administrators, because you give all administrators, for instance, FIDO2 keys or FIDO2 tokens, then definitely you should enforce it via conditional access policies. In such case, the other policy, the policy number 1 that I talked about at the beginning of this session, is redundant, because that did the same but required MFA in general. Requiring phishing resistant MFA is stricter So the other policy would be redundant. But I would say in most cases, unfortunately, it's not possible, not feasible to require phishing-resistant authentication for all administrators because they simply don't have the way to satisfy it. And then you can enforce it, at least, for instance, I don't know, for global administrators or a specific group of administrators, and all other administrators will use the standard MFA. But definitely your ultimate goal should be to enforce phishing-resistant authentication for your most privileged roles, because phishing-resistant authentication is the most secure authentication method that's available. Policy number 17, block device code flow. We target all users, break glass account excluded, all cloud applications, and here in the conditions we target authentication flow of device code flow. Device code flow is a way of authentication when you don't use your username and password and potentially MFA, but you use a code. This is a scenario, for instance, when you need to sign into like some specific devices with your account, but the devices don't support or don't have a comfortable way of the normal authentication process. So you can open a specific page on the devices and you do the authentication technically on your phone, for example, or your computer, and it generates a code and you just put the code to the device, and that's device code flow. Device code flow is potential way how a threat actor can get access to your identity without actually doing any authentication at all. So if the threat actor is able to trick your users to generate the code for the code flow, then the threat actor will be able to use the code and don't do any MFA, don't do any normal authentication. In most cases, device code flow is not used. So it doesn't have to be enabled and it can be disabled like this. But obviously, it's probably a good idea to first create this policy in the report-only mode, keep it in report-only mode for like a month or so, and then enforce it when you know that it's not actually used. Next is require MFA for Microsoft Entra join. We target all users, break glass account excluded, and here we target again a user action. So we changed from cloud apps to user actions and checked this register or join devices. And what we require here is MFA. Because by default, users can join or register devices to Microsoft Entra ID without doing any MFA at all. They just use their username and password and can register or join devices to Microsoft Entra ID. The problem is that if the credentials are compromised, then a threat actor would be able to join their own device to Entra ID, and potentially the device then might become compliant and bypass some of the restrictions that you have configured via conditional access policies that require a compliant device. That's the reason why the device join process should be secured. And that's what this policy does. So it requires MFA for Entra join or Entra registration. Policy number 19 requires reauthentication for security info registration. Again, we target all users, break glass account is excluded. We target one user action, which is security info registration. We have done this already before. And the only thing we configure here is the session lifetime, where we configure that sign-in frequency is every time. What it means is, it's an extension of the previously configured policy that required multi-factor authentication. Because like I've already said, the tokens may already contain the claim that the user has done multi-factor authentication in the past. Then the MFA technically would not be required for the security info registration process. But we need to be sure, or we want to be sure, that the security information registration process is really secure. So we want users to re-authenticate every time. And this is the reason for the policy to be configured. So it simply just requires the authentication every time when users are doing security info registration. Policy number 20, require compliant device for mobile app access. We target all users, the break glass account is excluded. We target all cloud apps. And here we target mobile device platforms. Again, we could include also desktop platforms, but there are two reasons for having it separated. One is again the reporting and troubleshooting. The other is that usually organizations first start with desktops, and when their desktops are enrolled and compliant, then they move on to mobile platforms. So it's practical to have two separated policies. One's targeting mobile platforms, the other one is targeting desktop platforms. But technically, you can include both desktop and mobile platforms in one policy. We target mobile apps and desktop clients only because that's what's also in the name of the policy. And what we want is, we want those devices to be compliant. What it means is that whenever someone is trying to access any of the corporate resources from a desktop or a mobile application, such as the Outlook, Teams, OneDrive client, and so on, they will have to use compliant devices. The reason for it is that the desktop applications synchronize data locally to the device. If the device is not compliant, it can be a personal computer, it can be any computer in the world. The application would potentially synchronize data offline to the device, but you don't know how the device is secure, if the device has disk encrypted, if the device actually has even a password for the user account configured. You don't know anything about the device. So that's very important to block it, which means this policy is here that requires devices to be marked as compliant. You can potentially configure it also a different way. What you can do is you can potentially do this filter for devices, and for devices that are not compliant, you can block access here. The reason for having it configured like this, require devices to be marked as compliant, is because if you go with the block option, it means that users will be blocked. It simply will be blocked with no option to satisfy the requirement. When you configure it this way, that you require devices to be marked as compliant, users will be actually asked to satisfy this requirement. So if they are using a phone that's not compliant, that's not enrolled into Intune device management, they will be asked to enroll the device to Intune so that the device becomes compliant. So for instance, Outlook will prompt them to enroll their devices to Microsoft Intune. And that's the difference. So it's more user-friendly. The users are actually guided to satisfy this requirement. All right, let's move on to policy number 21, which does the same thing just for desktop platforms. So all users included, break glass account excluded, all cloud applications. Here we target the two desktop platforms, the same client app, which is again mobile apps and desktop clients, and the grant is again the same. So require device to be marked as compliant. Same thing, same reasons. Policy number 22, block guest access to sensitive applications. Here we target guests and external users, no exclusions configured, because again, there is no need to put the break glass account here because break glass account is not an external user, so it won't be applied to the break glass account at all. But again, you can put the account there, it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't change anything. We target one specific app, which is again the Microsoft admin portals, and what we do is block. External users in general shouldn't have any access to your admin portals. And this policy actually enforces it. So external users will be blocked completely from accessing any of the internal admin portals. Of course, there might be some exclusions. Maybe you have external contractors that manage some service for you. Then obviously you need to either exclude those contractors from this policy or don't configure this policy at all. But like I said, it's not one size fits all, and these policies are just ideas what you should consider, what you should maybe configure or enforce. All right, policy number 23, block offline autopilot registration. We target all users, break glass account excluded, all cloud applications, and the conditions are device platform is Windows, because Autopilot is a Windows thing. It doesn't work with any other platforms. And here we have a filter for devices configured. The reason for this policy is it's a recent discussion or observation, because someone found that the offline autopilot profile actually is a way how you can potentially bypass some restrictions and enroll a personal computer that would be marked as a corporate device in Intune. Because devices enrolled through Autopilot are always automatically marked as corporate devices. And you may have policies that allows some things, the most sensitive things potentially, only for corporate devices, not for personal devices. So even if you support bring your own device, you may have in Intune personal devices enrolled. But if a user is able to enroll their own device through the offline Autopilot enrollment option, their personal device will become a corporate device automatically in Intune, which is usually something you don't want. Microsoft has already fixed this issue, and devices that are enrolled through offline Autopilot profile, which technically is just the JSON, such devices are marked as personal devices in Intune. So technically this policy is probably not necessary anymore, but just to be sure, you can block access for all devices that are enrolled through offline Autopilot profile. Unless obviously you use offline Autopilot profile, but that's extremely rare. Honestly, I have never seen that. I have never seen any organization using offline Autopilot profiles. So it's a good idea to block it completely. That's in general the recommendation. So block everything that you don't need, that you don't use. So the grant is block. So whenever a device is enrolled through the offline Autopilot enrollment option, such device will be blocked. Next thing is block authentication transfers. We target all users, excluding the break glass account, all cloud applications, and the condition is configured here like the authentication flows are authentication transfers. Authentication transfer is kind of similar to device code flow, as also probably the reason why it falls into the same category. Authentication transfers are the way how you can authenticate on one device and transfer the authentication to another device. So let's say you configure your Outlook on desktop and transfer the authentication to your phone. So you don't have to authenticate again on your phone. That's actually the thing that Outlook recommends you doing by default when you are configuring your account for the first time in desktop Outlook. It prompts you to use Outlook on your phone, and on the background that would do the authentication transfer. Again, it's potentially a weakness that could be abused by a threat actor, so it's a good idea to block it. So the grant here is block. Policy number 25, require guests to re-authenticate. In this policy, we target only guests and external users. No exclusions again needed. All cloud applications, and what we do is via session control we require authentication every time. So whenever a guest or external user is trying to access some of your resources, It may be a file shared via OneDrive. These external users will be asked to re-authenticate every time. It may be in some cases annoying if you collaborate a lot with external users. Maybe it's not a good idea to enforce this, but again, just something that you should think about. Policy number 26. Require terms of use agreement from external users. Again, we target external users and guests. No exclusions needed. All cloud applications, and the only thing we require is terms of use for external users. First of all, before you are able to configure this policy, you need to configure your terms of use. Technically, it's a PDF file that you upload to Microsoft Entra ID. You fill some additional information, and then this button appears in conditional access policies. So what we do is we require external users to agree with your terms of use before they are actually able to access your resources. So it's just some kind of a compliance or legal thing. Maybe you don't need to require that. Maybe you do. Again, just a thing to consider. But you need to prepare your own terms of use. So there is no like template predefined or something. And last policy is block access for users with insider risk. It's a setting that again requires P2 licenses, and this is still in preview. We target all users, break glass account excluded. External users are also excluded. We target all cloud apps. And the condition here is this insider risk. When the insider risk is elevated, we block access. Insider risk is a risk related to people who would potentially leak information, probably intentionally. So when the risk is high, then the access will be blocked. It's in preview, so maybe it's not a good idea to yet implement it in your production environment. That was all for the conditional access policies. I hope you found it useful. If you liked it, please let me know. If you have any questions, leave me a comment. If you find it useful, share this with your colleagues, with your peers, with your friends from other organizations as well. Don't forget to keep subscribing to my videos. Don't forget that I have also my weekly newsletter that talks about everything in IT and cybersecurity that happened in the past week. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you next time on some of my other videos. Thanks for watching.